At 4:30 p.m. on May 9, 1980, a quiet stretch of dirt road in the San Gabriel Mountains became a battlefield, and no one watching the evening news could have imagined how it started. 4 armed men stood behind a yellow pickup truck at a dead end, rifles raised bodies, braced eyes locked down a winding mountain road where sirens echoed closer by the second. A police helicopter had already been forced out of the sky. A sheriff's deputy was already dead, and more than 30 law enforcement vehicles were converging on a scene that looked less like a crime in progress and more like a war zone. What makes this moment so disturbing isn't the gunfire or the scale of the response. It's the fact that less than 2 hours earlier, these same men had walked into a suburban bank, threatened no one for long, and walked out with cash in under 2 minutes. No hostages, no prolonged standoff, just another bank robbery, until it wasn't. Somewhere between that bank lobby and this mountain road, the rules collapsed. Violence escalated beyond control. Jurisdictions blurred, radios failed, and ordinary policing collided head-on with weapons beliefs and resolve it was never designed to face. This was not a spontaneous eruption of chaos. It was the endpoint of years of fear, ideology, preparation, and a quiet conviction that the world was already ending. What unfolded next would stretch across 40 miles, involve 6 agencies, change how American police arm themselves, and leave behind a question that still matters. Decades later, when people truly believe the end is inevitable, how far are they willing to go, and how quickly does society follow them there? George Wayne Smith did not begin his life as a criminal, and that is precisely what makes this story unsettling. He grew up in a stable American household, excelled in school, played sports, sang in church, and outwardly followed the path laid out for millions of young men in post-war America. Nothing in his early years suggested violence was inevitable. But beneath that normalcy lived a fixation. Most people suppress the persistent urge to understand death control and what it means to take a life. These were not outbursts of rage or cruelty. They were quiet intellectual curiosities explored in private conversations, rationalized rather than resisted. When George entered the U.S. military during the height of the Cold War, those thoughts found structure. He was trained to think in terms of strategy, deterrence, and annihilation. He learned how nuclear weapons worked, how fast cities could disappear, how close the world lived to extinction every single day. To George, this knowledge didn't inspire restraint. It inspired clarity. If governments planned for the end of civilization, then collapse wasn't a fear, it was a schedule. Returning home to a country gripped by anxiety, economic instability, and apocalyptic rhetoric, George gravitated toward beliefs that mirrored his internal logic. At Calvary Chapel, global events were framed as signs, not coincidences. War, earthquakes, political unrest, all evidence that judgment was imminent. Prophecy gave his fear meaning. It transformed uncertainty into certainty. The world wasn't breaking down randomly. It was unfolding exactly as foretold. And once George accepted that conclusion, morality itself began to shift. If the end was unavoidable, then laws were temporary consequences irrelevant, and preparation became a moral duty. Violence could be justified as foresight. Weapons were not symbols of aggression, but tools of survival. This wasn't madness in the traditional sense. It was something more dangerous, a belief system that made destruction feel logical, even righteous. Long before the first shot was fired in Norco, the most important line had already been crossed in George's mind. The world was already over. Preparation did not look like desperation to George Wayne Smith and Christopher Harvin. It looked like discipline. What they were building in a quiet Riverside County neighborhood was not a criminal operation, but a contingency plan for collapse. They fortified a suburban home the way others might fortify a belief, slowly, methodically, convinced that prudence would one day look like prophecy. A bunker took shape beneath the house. An escape tunnel was carved by hand. Food, fuel, and medical supplies were stockpiled with the seriousness of men who believed time itself was running out. And then there were the weapons. In 1980, most local police officers carried a 6-shot .38 caliber revolver and little else. George and Christopher, by contrast, assembled an arsenal that belonged on a battlefield: battle rifles, semi-automatic carbines, shotguns, thousands of rounds of ammunition, and homemade explosives designed to amplify fear as much as force. They practiced reloads. They modified magazines. They rehearsed movements until they became muscle memory. This was not reckless accumulation. It was ritualized readiness. The money to sustain it came from wherever it could: legal work at first, then marijuana cultivation, when costs rose and jobs disappeared. Each compromise felt justified by the same logic: the world was about to reset, and survival favored the prepared. The bank robbery, when it entered their thinking, was never framed as theft. It was financing, a temporary breach of a system they believed was already doomed. The plan itself was clean, efficient, and deceptively simple: diversion, speed, escape. 2 minutes in and out. No unnecessary violence. A test run before everything changed. What they failed to grasp was that preparation creates momentum. Once enough time, belief, and effort are invested, stopping feels more dangerous than continuing. By the time the plan was finalized, the machinery was already in motion, and the line between readiness and inevitability had quietly disappeared. Every plan depends on the world behaving as expected, and this one began to unravel the moment it didn't. The diversion bomb was supposed to fracture reality. Sirens screaming away from the bank streets, emptied police resources pulled miles off course. Instead, chance intervened in the most mundane way possible. A passing civilian noticed smoke, acted instinctively, and extinguished the flames before the device could do its work. No explosion, no chaos, no response. Inside the stolen van, the absence of sirens felt louder than failure. Minutes stretched. Doubt crept in. Arguments surfaced, sharp and quiet, each man suddenly aware that momentum was slipping. This was the final exit ramp, the moment where walking away was still possible. But retreat would have meant admitting that the vision was flawed, that all the preparation might have been for nothing. And belief, once invested, resists collapse more fiercely than reason. They had already crossed smaller lines, kidnapping a driver carrying military-grade weapons into a civilian neighborhood, convincing themselves that restraint would still be possible. Waiting any longer felt like losing control, and losing control was the one outcome they feared more than arrest. When they finally moved, it was not with confidence, but with urgency masquerading as resolve. Inside the bank, the robbery itself unfolded almost exactly as planned. Efficient, brief, nearly clinical. But outside, reality was already catching up. A witness across the street noticed something wrong. A phone call was made. A patrol unit responded faster than anyone expected. When the doors burst open and a marked police car appeared directly in front of them, there was no time left for calculation. The first shots were fired not out of strategy but reflex. In that instant, the operation transformed. What had been framed as a controlled act became an irreversible crisis, driven forward by panic-wounded pride and the terrifying understanding that there was no way back to the world they had just left behind. Once the first shots were fired, the robbery ceased to exist as an event and became something far more dangerous, a moving crisis with no natural endpoint. The death of the teenage driver shattered whatever illusion of control remained, and from that moment forward, every decision was made under the pressure of survival rather than strategy. The robbers abandoned the van in a storm of gunfire, unleashing hundreds of rounds at responding deputies with a volume and intensity few officers had ever faced outside of training scenarios. A stolen pickup truck became the new escape vehicle, its open bed converted into a rolling firing platform as they tore through suburban streets, bullets tearing into patrol cars, traffic lights, and storefronts. What followed was not a chase in the cinematic sense, but a fragmentation of order, as law enforcement units from multiple jurisdictions flooded into the pursuit without shared command-compatible radios or a clear understanding of what they were up against. On surface streets, officers were forced to choose between pursuit and public safety, weaving through civilian traffic while rounds cracked overhead. When the chase spilled onto Interstate 15, the scale of the threat escalated again. At highway speeds, one of the gunmen climbed into the bed of the truck and fired a rifle directly down the freeway, transforming a major artery into an active combat zone. Improvised explosives were hurled backward, detonating against asphalt and forcing pursuing vehicles to swerve or fall back. Above it all, a police helicopter tracked the truck from roughly 800 feet in the air, its presence a reminder that the system was adapting in real time. That illusion collapsed when rifle fire reached the aircraft, puncturing its fuselage and filling the cabin with smoke, forcing the pilot into an emergency landing. The message was unmistakable. No layer of response was untouchable. As the robbers pushed north, the environment itself began to work against coordination. Jurisdictions shifted, radio delays compounded, and terrain narrowed from city grid to mountain roads, where blind curves and elevation changes favored ambush over pursuit. Officers at the front of the chase knew they were driving into uncertainty, unable to see what waited ahead or receive timely warnings from above. Each mile widened the gap between the tools of ordinary policing and the reality unfolding in front of them. The escalation was no longer about escape or money. It had become a collision between belief-fueled resolve and an infrastructure never designed to confront it. By the time the chase reached the mountains, the system was no longer reacting to a crime, it was struggling to contain a force it barely understood. The mountains, which had offered concealment and control only minutes earlier, suddenly delivered the one thing belief could not overcome: a physical limit. The road curved sharply along the hillside and then vanished, ending in a raw 50-foot scar where a landslide had erased the asphalt entirely. The stolen truck skidded to a stop momentum, collapsing into silence as dust drifted through the trees. There was no time to regroup, no chance to reconsider. Behind them, patrol cars crept forward through the haze, officers straining to see shapes through swirling dirt and pine needles, radios lagging seconds behind reality. Warnings came too late. Gunfire erupted almost instinctively, tearing through the quiet with a violence that felt both sudden and inevitable. Deputy James Evans rounded the bend into chaos, barely able to register what he was facing, before rounds struck around him. He returned fire with everything he had, emptying his revolver and managing to hit one of the gunmen before being fatally wounded himself. Nearby, another officer was struck and collapsed, the sound of his impact swallowed by the canyon. For a brief moment, the firefight froze. No movement, no return fire, just the echo of shots and the realization that someone was not getting back up. This was the point where the narrative broke open. There was no longer an escape plan, no illusion of control, no righteousness left to lean on. Faced with a dead end and the irreversible weight of a life lost, the men made their final choice. They did not stand their ground. They did not surrender. They scattered into the wilderness, abandoning the truck, the money, and whatever remained of the certainty that had driven them this far. The road had ended, and with it the belief that preparation could outpace consequence. When the gunfire finally stopped, nothing about. The silence felt like relief. Night settled over the mountains, cold and unforgiving, and the reality that followed was far less cinematic than the chaos that preceded it. The men who had imagined surviving the end of the world were now alone, wounded, soaked by rain, and running out of strength. Blood loss replaced adrenaline. Hunger replaced resolve. The wilderness offered no bunker, no prophecy, no refuge, only exposure and exhaustion. Law enforcement, by contrast, shifted from pursuit to containment. Hundreds of officers converged methodically, joined by SWAT teams, K-9 units, helicopters, and search and rescue crews, transforming the hills into a slow, tightening net. One by one, the fugitives were located not through confrontation, but collapse. One surrendered at dawn, shivering, dehydrated, and barely able to stand. Two others were found wandering, disoriented, the certainty that once bound them reduced to confusion and fear. Another ran until his body failed, hiding beneath brush. As helicopters swept overhead, the sound of rotors closing in on him hour by hour. By the time officers approached, the confrontation was brief and final. When it was over, the cost of the preceding hours became impossible to ignore. 2 of the 5 robbers were dead. A deputy lay dead as well, leaving behind a family that would measure time differently forever. Civilians had been injured, including a child whose life was altered by a stray bullet. The aftermath did not feel like victory for anyone involved. It felt like reckoning, a quiet inventory of lives, broken beliefs dismantled, and consequences that could not be undone, no matter how deeply anyone wished the clock could be turned back. The Norco Shootout did not end when the last suspect was captured or killed. It continued, quietly reshaping American law enforcement in ways few people noticed at the time. In the days that followed, departments across Southern California reviewed after-action reports that read less like police summaries and more like battlefield assessments. Officers had been outgunned, outranged, and outmatched by civilians armed with weapons designed for war. That realization carried consequences. Within weeks, sheriff's departments began acquiring semi-automatic rifles, high-capacity magazines, and armored vehicles. Training shifted. Tactics evolved. The line between police work and military response grew thinner, not out of ambition, but out of fear of being unprepared again. Over the following decades, billions of dollars in surplus military equipment would flow to local agencies across the country, fundamentally altering how American policing looked, moved, and sounded. Norco became an early warning, one that foreshadowed future confrontations where ideology, firepower, and grievance collided with public safety. Yet the deeper legacy of Norco cannot be measured in weapons inventories or policy changes alone. It lives in the psychological residue left behind in the families who buried loved ones, and in the enduring question of how belief shapes behavior. George Wayne Smith would spend the rest of his life in prison, eventually expressing remorse for the damage caused on May 9, 1980. His words arrived decades too late to change outcomes, but they offered a rare glimpse into the aftermath of certainty unraveling. The apocalypse he prepared for never came. The planetary alignment passed without consequence. Civilization did not collapse. What did change was quieter and more enduring trust eroded, institutions hardened, and fear found new justifications. Norco stands as a reminder that the most dangerous forces are not always external threats, but internal narratives left unchallenged, stories that turn anxiety into conviction and conviction into action. Long after the gunfire faded from the San Gabriel Mountains, the impact of that day continued to ripple outward, a case study in how deeply held beliefs can bend reality, and how society is often forced to adapt not to what happens, but to what people are willing to believe will happen. Norco is not just a story about guns, crime, or a single violent day in 1980. It is a warning about what happens when fear hardens into certainty, when belief goes unchallenged, and when people convince themselves that the future is already written. Ordinary lives did not collapse because the world ended, they collapsed because someone believed it had to. The lesson is uncomfortable, but necessary. Ideas can be as dangerous as weapons, especially when they offer simple answers to complex fears. If this story made you pause, reflect, or see the world a little differently, take a moment to support the work. Like the video, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel. These stories matter, and so does paying attention before the next one begins.